Good afternoon, folks. My name is Rafael Rodriguez. I'm the Executive Director of Residential Life here at the University of Vermont. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to connect with us. I know lunchtime is not always the easiest time to make this happen, but I really do appreciate those folks who have been able to take time out of their day to connect with us. We'll be spending our time together connecting over a couple of things. Let me just set the tone for our roughly hour together. We'll spend some time today talking about the housing process, just really hitting on a few key notes and pieces of information that will be helpful for some of you. We'll spend most of the time, the bulk of our time, talking about the return to housing selection process, how it's different this time around than when your students were first coming in, also how it's conceptualized a bit differently here at UVM. And then we'll spend some time, of course, talking about managing expectations, what you can expect, what your student can expect. And finally, we'll get to some Q&As. We have already inserted some of your questions into the presentation. Our hope was that as you submitted questions in advance, we did a good job of sort of integrating the information and the answers and responses to your questions and thoughts throughout the presentation. All right, so I believe we're encouraging folks to submit questions throughout, so please feel free to do that, okay? All right, so let's get started. First, some key important housing info and updates for us to discuss. We want to make sure that we talk about what it means to be required on campus. Before that, pardon me. We want to hit some notes on some updates regarding our housing process first. We have shifted a bit our timeline for housing. Typically, we start a housing process in early January. As you've noted, we have pushed this back for a couple of reasons. Number one, we are having some learning community open houses, and what we wanted to do is provide your students the opportunity to go around and learn about different learning communities if they were interested. So rather than rushing the process, we wanted to make sure that folks had the opportunity to learn about different experiences they can have on campus. Also, for some of you, your students might have just joined us as spring starts. They might have just started at the university a couple weeks ago, and it's kind of rough to ask them on the first week back to begin thinking about their housing options for next year. So we try to build some time in. Okay. Let's talk about our housing process in general. First, we'll talk about who's required to live on campus, and we'll speak a bit on the housing residency requirement. For our students, most people conceptualize it as living on campus their first and sophomore years. The way we actually conceptualize this and talk about this for our residency requirement is that students are required to live on campus for 4 semesters. More often than not, that does mean their first year and their sophomore year. Of course, there are circumstances in which students decide to go abroad, in which it does not count against them. We have folks who, for example, might take a leave or a withdrawal. Those often do not count against them. But when we're talking about folks who are required to live on campus, we're specifically talking about the 4 semester requirement on the sophomore and first year. I do want to talk about the fact that we do have housing available for non-required students. If your student is currently living on campus, as long as they follow the housing timeline, we will be able to guarantee them space. So again, key part of what you're going to hear me discuss quite a few times today is the importance of following the timelines. Right? This can be a great opportunity for your child, for your student to really learn and engage in what it means to be an adult. And adulting by following timelines, this is going to be critical. So again, if your student is currently on campus as a sophomore and is interested in housing again as a junior for next year, we will be able to offer them housing so long as they follow our housing process timelines. So some information to take note of. Student accessibility service and trading spaces, 2 things I want to note and talk about. First, I will share that any students who requires an accessibility accommodation, we do have a timeline for that. It's February 14th. As you know, many students do require a specific housing accommodation need. That can be room type, that can be often some specific living conditions. We want to make sure that we're able to meet everyone's accommodation by February 14th. That is a critical time and date for us to make sure we can ensure your students' needs are met. If students do file or update their access accommodations after the fact, of course, we will do our best and we'll try very hard to get that accommodation met for best consideration and to ensure that students are getting their needs met. We really ask that folks stick hard to that February 14th date. That's only a couple weeks from now, so please make sure you're speaking with your child about their accommodation needs, their housing accommodation needs for next year. The other piece I'll talk about is, we're talking today all about our housing selection process. Please know that in April, we'll have our trading spaces process, and that's another opportunity for students who might not be satisfied or might wish to consider a different housing opportunity or option to do so. So if for the first time the desired result is not what your child wanted, they still would have another opportunity to engage in requesting a trade or a change of their housing circumstances. We're going to talk about the return to housing selection. And this is where we spend most of our time. And when we think about housing, the return to housing selection, I want you all to think about two big pieces: the learning community and the roommate preferences. Those are the pieces that are different for our returners than our first years. As you know, when your child was coming in last summer, the main driver of their housing selection process was a learning community placement. This time around, the focus is on both learning community and their roommate preferencing. And I'm going to spend some time talking about both, okay? First, I'll go through all the learning communities that they will have an option to preference. You might notice some have gone away from their first year. Some of the choices might have gone away, but also additional choices have come up. So arts and creativity is one of our learning communities, really focusing on the exploration of arts and themes. Cultural crossroads, focusing on developing the student into a global citizen to engage across difference. We have Honors College, and Honors College is limited to folks who are a member of the Honors College. So this is both a living community, a living learning community. It's also a college, and only students who are currently in the Honors College are eligible to live there. We have innovation entrepreneurship. This is the home where folks are able to explore and engage in new creative ideas and problem solving, really tackling some of the biggest issues in our communities at a local and global scale. Journey to Independence is specifically for our non-required students. So I talked a bit about this. Here we're talking about our juniors and seniors, or folks who have met their residency requirement but desire to live on campus. Journey to Independence is a great learning community where folks can engage in some what we call adulting skills. They'll begin to focus on preparing for the job search, developing resumes. They have programming around how to cook, how to manage a budget. It doesn't mean that if your student is not required to live on campus that this is the only place they can live in. They can also live in any of the other learning communities. However, this specific learning community is targeted to that population. Leadership and Social Change is one of our other learning communities, which continues to grow, really focusing on how do we make the change we need to make this a better space and a better world for all. Outdoor Experience continues to be a very popular program. It's all about exploring the outdoors and engaging with nature, especially in our Vermont context. We have plenty of it. Sustainability focuses on how we can be good stewards and better stewards of our community by making sure that we are living and walking the walk and talking the talk around our commitment as an institution to being sustainable across all of our practices. And of course, the wellness environment, which does change in location for returners. It's no longer in the new residence hall. That is only for first-time first years. Wellness environment is on Redstone campus, focusing on making sure that our students are engaging in healthy habits, focusing on having healthy brains and healthy bodies. There is another housing options for our returning students. Traditional housing is an option if folks choose not to be in a learning community. For returners, that is absolutely allowed. If folks choose and end up in traditional housing, they will be placed in either one of the residence halls that is labeled as traditional, which is Converse Hall, and or within the learning communities. There's no way of knowing exactly where they will end up, but it's not just one building. It's actually spaces throughout all these learning communities and or a specific building. It just means that they'll be able to engage at their own desire with the programming that takes place. For our sophomores, we actually have another opportunity for them to get involved and engage at a deeper level. So in addition to these learning community options, students will also be asked to preference a learning community focus. So the following learning communities that you see listed have a specific focus. As students go and begin to rank their learning communities on their housing contract, they'll see and receive questions around a specific focus within these learning communities. These are not required focus, but if a student wishes to engage in a deeper level, they are able to do so within these specific learning communities. All that I've talked about with respect to learning communities will take place in the housing contract, which has opened as of yesterday. Your child should have received by now an email letting them know that their housing and meal contract is open. That is where they will do all of the preferencing for their learning communities and also identify any specific focus. What you see up on the screen are just options or where the learning communities are placed for returners. It is slightly different for many of these places than first time, first year. So we often share this with students so that they know that there's a difference in where the learning communities are placed. So as I said, the return to housing selection is driven by two pieces. First is learning community, the next is roommate preferencing. I'm gonna first talk a little bit about choosing a different learning community, and then I'll head over and discuss the roommate preferencing portion of the housing selection process. It is absolutely possible and encouraged in many parts for students to explore and engage in a different learning community. Students do not have to choose the same learning community they are currently a part of. In fact, often students choose to engage in or participate in different learning communities. We do have priority into the same learning community if students have successfully completed the course. So let me just get into that a little bit. If I'm currently in my learning community, and that learning community, for example, might be the wellness environment, I can choose to return to the wellness environment. And if I successfully completed my course, I will have priority into that community. If I choose to go into another learning community, meaning I choose that other learning community first, then I lose that preference, right? I lose that priority. So in order for students to take advantage of the priority into their current learning community, number one, they would have needed to complete the course successfully, meaning basically pass the course, and they would need to rank it first. If they do not rank it first, they do lose that priority. I think about this a bit like dating, right? If you are interested in someone, then you kind of have to commit. If you want to explore other relationships, well, that door is no longer open to you, at least healthy relationships, I say. So this is the opportunity where students are able to preference their learning community that they're currently in and get priority. Otherwise, they will have to go into, they will have equal opportunity, randomized, I should say, into other learning community options. Let's talk a bit about roommates now. So a big driver, given our limited inventory for our housing process, as I mentioned, is our learning community, and then our roommate preferencing. Often in many schools and in other places, what drives the return to housing selection is often a room type. Folks are trying to get a good understanding of what are all the hoops and loops I have to jump to in order to get that beautiful single with that mountain view. That's not possible given our housing infrastructure. It's not how we operate. It ensures, or that approach ensures that 12% of you will be happy and the other 88 will be completely miserable. So what we do is we right size and refocus our housing selection process. What we know and find important are learning communities because we know these are intentional ways for students to engage. What we have heard from our students that it's equally as important to them are roommate preferencing. Those two variables we can control and for the most part have a pretty successful opportunity to meet students' needs. Once you start getting to the specific room with the view, with the overhanging patio, then that just becomes undoable. It ensures that folks are not happy. What we can guarantee or what we can pretty much commit to is a successful output for the housing selection process based on those two variables, roommate selections or roommate preferencing and learning community preferencing. Students are able to preference their roommate on the application, the same place where they're also selecting and ranking their learning community options. Our students will be able to go in and preference 1, 2, and or if they're in a quad, up to 3 roommates. Students can preference another person as long as the other individual has started their housing contract. So if I'm trying to look for my roommate Ben and I want to preference him because he was the greatest roommate this year, and I do not see Ben, I promise you there's nothing broken with the system. It is most likely because Ben has not started the housing application. So it'll be helpful for your student to make sure he gets on Ben so that he can begin his process and preference him. You don't have to preference a roommate. Many folks do, but it's not required. What we try to do and try to ensure is that we meet both housing selection, learning community placement desire, and roommate preference desire. Another piece that's important for folks to know is if you have a student who wants both their ideal learning community and their preferred roommate, it's going to be incredibly important for both roommates to preference the exact same learning communities in the exact same order. Meaning their rankings should be similar or should be exact in order for us to guarantee them the best opportunity to be with their preferred roommate and to be in the learning community placement that they desire. What happens if those learning community options or rankings do not match? Well, we're going to try our best to for sure keep the roommate pairs together, but they might not end up in the learning community placement of their choice, at least not their top choice. I hope that makes sense. Again, I encourage folks to continue to ask questions and submit them. So we have a few questions from you that we have received, so I'm going to answer these. These are what if roommate scenarios. These are the most fun to respond to as we try to figure out some of the nuances involved in this process. So folks are typically asking what goes into the process of selecting a specific roommate and suite mate. I think I talked about that. As long as it is mutual preferencing of the roommates, you should be set. And as long as the learning community rankings are similar, they should be getting maybe hopefully their top choice, if not somewhere within their top choice. Where it begins to fall apart is if those rankings are not mutual. Okay, both roommates have to rank each other in the contract. Another challenging piece for us is often, again, your child being very excited to room with Ben, preferences Ben, but you know what? Ben is actually not that thrilled to room with your child and doesn't preference your child. And then we get a call saying, well, what's going on? Someone messed up the process. And unfortunately, your student and Ben did not discuss the fact that they're not mutual preferences. So that's often what happens. So as long as we can do those two pieces, roommate preferences being mutual and learning community placements also being similar in their ranking, you should be set. We'll talk more about room selection later on and how that impacts room selection, which is different from learning community placement. Our goal in this process of learning community ranking placement and roommate preferences is, again, to always try to keep the roommate pairs together and try as best as we can to provide folks with their highest ranked learning community. We try to do that in as equal of possible manner as possible. We have an algorithm that tries to do the best matching and give folks their best, their highest priority. We know that we can't do that for everyone. If we have a specific learning community, for example, that has lots of interest, that won't be possible, unfortunately, but we really do try our best. Just reading through a few more questions to see if there's anything here that I haven't answered. Yep, we got questions about Honors College. Again, pull-ins into the Honors College is not, it's not something that can occur. The Honors College is specifically for those students who are part of the college. So if your child is not a member of the Honors College but wants to live with someone who is, unfortunately, they can live together, but it cannot be in the Honors College. Okay, I think we're good with those questions. So we talked a bit about the housing selection process. Our housing selection process, again, as I said, runs in two phases. The first phase I talked about is the phase that's open right now. We have our contracts open where students are filling out their, students are filling out their learning community ranking as well as their preferred roommate. Now we're gonna spend some time talking about the room selection process, a little bit about what it looks like, okay? At some point, your student will receive an email informing them of their learning community placement. If we've done a good job, and if your student has filled out everything accurately, then it will be a high likelihood that both the roommate pairs and or the roommate groups would have received placement in the same LC. They will also receive information regarding their time block for housing, for room selection. So once they are in the learning community, what that does is it sort of shrinks and defines what spaces are available to them because they don't have their pick of the entire campus. Instead, they can pick a room within their learning community. We determine our housing selection blocks based on student completed credit hours earned. So based on your credit hours, that's what gives you priority. What that means is, although you might technically be a sophomore, if you have not completed the level of credits needed to be a sophomore, you won't be a part of that sophomore selection. Okay? So credit hours is what informs this. After credit hours, you probably have a good sized number of students within the same grouping of credit hours, and an algorithm sort of randomly assigns numbers beyond this. Students are able to pick specific rooms at this point. So after they've been placed into a learning community bucket and have been in the same learning community, placed in the same learning community as their roommate, once they get their time slot, they'll be able to go into the housing system, select their room, their specific room and floor they want to be a part of. So we're talking a bit about managing expectations and how we work. We try to be sure and intentional about our housing inventory, meeting as many of the needs as possible. Now, I said earlier that unfortunately, based on our infrastructure, we don't have the opportunity to guarantee everyone a single. We do not frame our housing selection process based on room type. It's just not possible. The reality is, I said 12%, but that was a bit generous. Our population of our inventory that are singles are only 11%, with about 30% being triples and the rest being doubles. That's important to know. So we focus strictly on room type. It just assures us that many folks are going to be dissatisfied. What we do again is try to elevate in our housing selection process the two variables that are most important to us and to students. When we sit down and talk to students, and we say, if you had to choose which is the most important, of course, they want it all. They want the roommate, they want the specific room type. But when we ask them what is the most important, they say our ability to choose a roommate. They've built strong relationships with folks. We want to honor those relationships. They are critical to your student success. And we also know the learning communities are. So that is how we manage our process. Again, we focus on learning community placement and our student roommate preferences. We have additional housing choices and information for you all to consider. We have access to accommodation housing requests. As we talked about this is managed through the Student Accessibility Services Office. So please make sure, again, February 14th is that critical date to ensure that we can meet your students' housing needs. We will always try to do that, but we have a better chance of doing so the earlier we get the request. We also have gender neutral housing that is not actually available on the contract. It used to be a separate process. If your child is interested in identifying a specific gender neutral housing need, they can do that right on the housing contract. We also have the collegiate recovery community for students who are in recovery as a housing option, and exploring Jewish culture as one of our smaller learning communities that has recently come up for sophomore specifically. So those are some additional housing choices that you can find more information about on our website. I'm going to talk a bit about moving and moving out. Folks were very, a student asking this question, I appreciate that, because moving in and moving out does look very different for your sophomore year, particularly those folks who are on central campus. So for move out, there isn't an organized moving committee. Move out happens throughout the course of several days, depending on your student's final schedule and their willingness and eagerness to leave from campus. So that does span over a longer period of time. So there isn't a set of move-in crew that happens is in place as it is during move-in. If you are on central campus, because of how tall the building is and the challenges of moving folks in and out, bids will be provided, particularly because there are elevators. Other parts of campus, the elevators are not as easy to get to, so we do not have bins everywhere. So that's the move out process. It looks different across campus. We do have bins for folks who are in the central campus residence halls. There isn't as a highly staffed presence as there is during move in. The same should be said for next year's sophomore move-in. There isn't the same welcome committee that there is for our first-time first years. So for the most part, students are in charge and managing their own move-in process. We do a good job of still managing traffic. I think folks had the same question around, can I still park in the same places? How do we get to campus for the sophomore move-in? Still the same way. You'll still be able to access the buildings and park as close as you can, depending on how traffic is looking. The only thing that is different is the move-in crew will not be available for your sophomore year. So that is a bit of a difference. Our approach at this point and how we navigate this process, there are many moving parts. The process has a couple of phases, and what we try to emphasize is making sure that students are meeting the deadlines. If they do not, then I think that's when maybe some frustration can come about. What we tell our returning students who are required to live on campus, meaning our students who have not completed the residency requirement, is that we will guarantee them a bed. So if they miss a part of the process, they will still be guaranteed a bed. Now what will happen is their peers will be getting much more information or be getting information much sooner, right? They might get their room assignments and their learning community assignments and sooner than they will. It doesn't mean that they won't get housing. They will just have to wait, particularly because they did not follow the timeline. So we have to move forward, as you can imagine, with the thousands of applicants and students who did follow the process. Those folks, because they follow the process, will hear from us soon. Then we'll come back and circle back to those folks who were missed or who did not follow through on their end. We talk about this being a student-centered process, right? This is absolutely an adulting and learning process. And we really strongly encourage that our students are at the driver's seat. Oftentimes, the information that we get, and the nuanced issues are often shared with us. Parents, you are great advocates and are helpful in supporting your students navigate the process. We ask that you support them in navigating the process, not driving it for them. It becomes a lot more difficult and it does not serve as a learning opportunity for them. For example, if they're not following the processes or the timelines and we're expecting and advocating for them to get an immediate response. That's not fair to folks who did follow the process, and we have to continue to move forward. So we ask you to be nuanced in your way of supporting them, ask questions, encourage them to follow up, but really put them in the driver's seat. This is the process of learning that you have invested quite a bit of time and money on to let them learn how to stand up and navigate these processes on their own. Always be a supporting ear, always be there to encourage them. We ask that you let them be in the driver's seat. Now, during this time, as you can imagine, not only are we managing a housing process for our returning students, we also have incoming applications for our soon-to-be first-year students, so our incoming class. It is quite a busy time in residential life. What that means is that you can expect our response time to be anywhere from 2 to 3 days for any single message. I guarantee you, if you have an email that you left, as long as an email and a voicemail, both will be responded to around that time frame. One method is not quicker than the other, and we want to make sure that we're responding as quickly as possible. So if you leave us a voicemail, if you get us on the phone, or if you send us an email, it would all take roughly around the same time. As you can imagine, we have quite a bit of requests coming in. There are some nuanced situations, right? There are some very specific nuanced situations that require a little bit more time and digging into. Those might take a little bit longer. I just want to make sure that we're setting up good expectations so that we can minimize your level of frustration, and we can also support the students during their level of during this process as well. What I'd like to say is that we have never had a process in which we've left anyone without any housing, right? If students need housing, we've always been able to accommodate that. The process by which we get there might take a little bit longer. We ask for your patience in this. As you can imagine, we manage bed spaces for 5,795 students. That's quite a large inventory. We do our best to get through them. It does take us some time depending on the nuanced situation. So that's our main focus on our student-centered process. We ask that you feel free to always reach out to us if you have any questions, and we will do our best to respond. I'm gonna bring us back and bring myself back so we can talk a bit about our Q&As. So we have questions coming in. I apologize, we have questions coming in here, and I'm gonna try to vet some of those here. Can sophomores bring cars is the first question, and the answer is yes. They should always contact parking and transportation services. That will be their best approach of making sure that they know what to do to get their cars registered and to get the appropriate permits they have. I've seen folks get very creative and park on the street. That can be a little bit tricky regarding parking rules and ticketing. So you want them to always go through the appropriate process. What happens if my student's intended roommate does not return? They will be assigned a random roommate. That is something that happens from time to time. Once a vacancy is in the room is confirmed. So oftentimes what we hear from students say is, I'm not coming back, but they filed no paperwork. There's nothing formally saying that there is a vacancy. We have students who want to pull someone in at that point, but the reality is, according to our records, according to all school records, the student is still attending UVM. Until we have received formal confirmation that they're no longer here, there is no vacancy. Oftentimes we do assign a random person to that room. If we have questions around 6 students trying to be in the suite and listing each other. Suite is a lot more complicated. The majority of our suites happen to be around cultural crossroads, which means you first have to get into that learning community and into a specific village before you can even preference together. So that is a bit more complicated. Students can request 1 or 2 roommates. They cannot request 6 roommates. That is much difficult for us to be able to meet that request. The question is, what if your roommate preference is someone from a different learning community? Does the current resident of the learning community they want have to move in to help with priority? I'm not understanding the question, sorry. If my student doesn't have a roommate preference, is roommate assignments random? Yep, they'll select a room on the day of their specific roommate roommate selection block. They'll go in, they'll select a place. Someone else will select that place. It'll be random. They don't have to preference a roommate. That's absolutely fine. Due to credits, are sophomores last for room selection? Yes, but remember, or I should say that the numbers of students with higher credit hours that actually stay on campus are a lot less. So we don't have as many sophomores, as many juniors and seniors staying on campus. So sophomores technically are the last, but the reality is the group of seniors and juniors on campus is a lot less. I'll grab some more questions. Providing context on deadlines for housing, was told this is a first come, first serve. A room selection calendar is on the website. Everyone who meets deadline gets equal consideration. So as we go through our process, if you fill out your application, whether you do it the day before the contract closes or the first day that it opens, at that point when we close the contract, everyone is given equal consideration and an equal chance. We put it into our algorithms in order to make the best LC placement. It's not first come, first serve. That would not be, that's not very equitable, particularly given our housing constraints. So we try to get all the contracts. We try to get your students to meet all their deadlines. And as information comes in, once we've hit our deadline is when we begin our process of assigning folks to learning community, trying to match those roommate preferences. And I think I told you a bit more about room selection that happens later. It's based on credit hours, and then after credit hours, it's all randomly assigned. That is the most equitable way we can do that given our housing constraints. Okay? Can you provide more info on quads? Where are they located? Very, very limited. We only have 6 quads on campus, and 3 of them are in areas for returners. One, I believe, is in Coolidge Hall. Can you remind me what the other ones are? They're all on Redstone campus. Is that correct? Sorry, we have 1 in Harris Millis, 1 in Redstone Hall, and 1 in Coolidge Hall. So 3 for returners. So I will say that triples exist in all of our learning communities and all of our learning community styles, right? So whether you are in a suite or not in a suite, we have triples in all of our housing, across all of our housing inventory. It's not limited to a specific building for returners. I will also say a quick note that I have not emphasized enough is your roommate preference does not determine your room type. So room types are suite styles, private, traditional, and those are doubles, triples, and singles. Because I have preference for roommate and have my roommate preference with me, that does not guarantee that I'll be placed in a double. I can be placed with my preferred roommate in a triple room. We should note that that happens with some regularity. Residential halls are smoke-free. What does the department do to ensure this? So we have our RAs on staff on campus. Of course, we have our smoke detectors that are within the halls to really look at and track any violation of smoking on campus. Our community walks are conducted by our resident advisors as well as our live-on staff. We have a couple of policies and approaches of addressing those. We have a smoke terms and conditions fee, right? So students are signing their housing contract right now. The contract has very explicit consequences for folks who smoke or cause anything to smoke, to emit any kind of smoke and or vapor within the residence hall. It is a fine that we assess students, and that is determined by, again, our community walks to take place by our RAs and our live-in staff. And we do the best we can. So the question is, if I want to if I want to room with someone who's in a different learning communities, if I'm in cultural crossroads and want to live in with someone who's from WE, if the person from WE has priority into their learning community and I choose to go into WE, will that help me out? Yes, it will, right? So that roommate's preference, that roommate's priority can help out someone who's outside of the learning community. So that's why we always tell folks, make sure those roommate preferences are mutual because it can actually work out in your favor. Any more questions? They're coming in right now. Are there any points that I should probably think about hitting on? I'm being told I did a good job, so feel free to get your questions, and we have more coming. Thank you. Some clarification for quads with respect to learning community. This is helpful. We have one in Harris, one in Millis. Those are sustainability and leadership respectively. We have one in outdoor experience in Redstone Hall, and the one in Christie, 3 in Christie Hall, part of the wellness environments. We have a couple more, actually, 6 total. Apologies for that. We welcome any more questions. We have received some from some of you, some great questions, and they were a bit nuanced. They sounded more like dissertation topics. So what we did was we referred those to our staff, and they should be in touch soon. Some of these housing questions that, as I mentioned earlier, are quite nuanced and really involve specific needs or specific circumstances. And those we like to get over to our staff to respond to them because they might take a little bit more conversation that I can't as easily answer here. So if you didn't hear your question answered, it's not because I didn't like the question, it's because we're trying to make sure that you get the response you needed. So we're getting some of these questions over to our team to respond to you on an individual basis. And I think we have a way of connecting and knowing, yep, I'm being told that we have a way of knowing who submitted those so we can get back to you. So again, each student, so it keeps coming in, each student can list up to 2 roommates maximum, right? Not 3. So that's actually my staff correcting my misinformation. They can only preference 2 roommates maximum, not 3. Anything else? Okay. If you list 2 roommates, will you be in a triple? That's yes. So we take roommate preferencing as these are the folks who you're asking us to make sure we pair you up with. Not if it's possible, you're asking us, please, what's most important to me are these learning community choices and these 2 people. If you choose 2 folks, will be placed in a triple. Part of where that's helpful is that in the housing selection process, because you'll be in a triple, you will most likely be able to select that triple room first. So that's a good perk. Actually, it's not uncommon for folks to opt into triples. We see that more than you might think. While many folks think that folks are running away from triples, we have a good number of folks who are saying, we were in a triple this year. Our parents hated it on move-in day. We love it now. We want to be in the same triple. So that happens with some regularity, actually. When will students know their LC placements and who they're living with? They'll know that by February 25th. They'll find out which learning community they're with and who their roommate will be. That will help inform and drive the room selection process, which is next after the fact. Students have from February 3rd to the 17th to make changes on their contract. That's important to know. So while they're here about their placement on the 25th, The time frame by which they can go into the contract and change it as many times as they want is between February 3rd and 17th. The way you can be most helpful is that you encourage your student to share with their desired roommate if they've made any changes to their ranking. So again, it can be mutual. And please begin to get comfortable with difficult conversations and let your preferred roommate know if they're no longer interested in them as a preferred roommate. It can save us all a lot of headache. Oftentimes, we are in an awkward place knowing that the person was not mutually preferenced, and we can say, I'm sorry, Ben did not choose you. We try not to do that because it can be uncomfortable, but we're often put in that predicament. We do not offer storage on campus. That's a great question, and folks often ask that. Unfortunately, we do not have the capacity or the infrastructure to offer any storage on campus. There are many many places in the Burlington community and outside of Burlington that have some access to storage units. They're not terribly expensive. We often encourage our students to work within the community to find any options they have. There are quite a few. We are in a college town. The storage business is not a bad business to be in if you live in a college town. There are a couple of options they can explore. I think we have maybe one or two more questions. Last questions. Are we at time?
No.
Okay, so we have a last question coming in. As folks are waiting, again, I will highlight a couple of things. It is a two-phase approach. Our first process that we're in right now from February 3rd through the 17th is signing the housing contract, which includes ranking your learning community placements and also preferencing your roommate. After that, students will be informed of their learning community placement by February 25th. Shortly after then, they'll receive an email with their room selection time slot. And if that, we hope for the best. If students are still requiring or hoping for a different outcome, we again have trading spaces, which will come back on in April as another opportunity for folks to require any shifts and changes. So this is how we navigate this process. We always encourage you to be in touch, and we'll do our best. Okay, so triple rooms are the largest. So question is, if we have two folks getting together, so we have a person who's asking a question, their children wants to be in a triple, and they're asking about the room size. We have been doing some intentional work over the past 2 years, and we can say that the triple rooms are the largest rooms in the building. We have done a lot of work, particularly this past year and the year before that, to ensure that the triple rooms within the building are the rooms with the largest square footage. So that is what you can expect. Okay. Well, I know that, again, as I said, it's difficult to get away during lunchtime. If we can end a bit early and that you all get something to eat before you go back to work, we'll do so. I thank everyone for attending the webinar. Please know that we have a general housing information that you can access on our website. It has an overview of our timeline. I thank you all for taking your time to connect with us, and I hope that this information was useful. If you know anyone who might benefit from watching this webinar, or who might just have some general questions that will come up that you heard the answers to, we will post this video for folks to reference. So we'll make sure we figure out how to get this to you, but we will do that. Okay, thank you all. I appreciate it and have a great day.